Okay, today we're going to be talking about the State Dental Practice Act. And I know, like, after your exam, I'm going to have you guys kind of look through that State Practice Act. And so you're going to find out a little bit of information about ours specifically there, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the during this PowerPoint. Here's your learning outcomes. There's a video that I have for you to watch on Blackboard, and I think it describes these really well. Now, I want you to recognize that what they're talking about is more on the national level, and the same thing also applies to a state level. Another thing for you to recognize is the Texas State Board of Dental Examiners falls under this executive branch. So, in the video, it's talking about the president and things like that, but they also fall under this on a state level. And I'll let you watch the video to find out more about that. There's something called common law versus statutory law. Now, statutory law is the thing where it's very specifically something written down that you can't speed or whatever, right? So the law is that the speed limit's 55, and if you go 85, you are breaking the law. That would be a statutory law. There's also laws that say you can't practice dental hygiene without a license, right? That would be something that's written down and is part of a law. A common law is something that is decided by the courts. And so there was an example that I was trying to understand this a little bit better. And there was an example of, say somebody got murdered, and they got murdered 30 years ago. And obviously that would be breaking a statutory law to murder somebody. Now, the problem is a lot of states have the, statute of limitations, where you can only prosecute somebody for, say, 5 years after the law. Well, in this particular case, that person, they didn't find out who it was until they had DNA evidence like several years later. So it was probably like 2015 or something like that. Well, according to the statutory law, they couldn't prosecute because it was past the 5 years. And a common law would say a judge might be able to come up with that and say, well, that doesn't really seem fair to me. I believe that, the reason why they didn't prosecute is because they didn't have the DNA evidence and they didn't even know who it was. That doesn't even make sense. So a judge could say, by common law, I'm going to say you can go ahead and practice it. But what I learned is statutory law is always followed over common law. So in that case, they would go back to statutory law and say, no, that's not okay. So what they would need to do in order to prosecute that person is go back to the legislators and change the law to say, unless new DNA evidence, is allowed, or something like that. But I'm trying to think of an example of a common law. It's just things that aren't necessarily written down, but we need a ruling on it one way. And usually once a judge rules on it, then those kind of in that area use that as precedent, and they also kind of follow suit. So that's what a common law is. So statutory law, like I said, is something written down. And so we have laws written down regulating the practice of dental hygiene. So it talks about what our scope of practice is. What are we allowed to do? What are we not allowed to do? Right now, they're hashing out the details of the teledentistry law that was just passed, saying that we could do teledentistry, and trying to figure out exactly what is allowed in that. Licensure requirements. So we have to do boards and practice and graduate from a CODA, school. We have to pass a regulatory rules and regulation test to see if you know that. So there's all these kind of things that are involved in that. It also talks about supervision, like how often do we need to have the dentist around? And you guys will have worked on that on your worksheet to kind of find out what the laws are here in Texas. Also, continuing education requirements. So rules and regulations, once they become law, this board, our Texas State Board of Dental Examiners, is used to implement and regulate the laws. So like I said, the law was passed that teledentistry was passed, but now they have to determine what was the intent of it. And so they're trying to write out the specific rule and add it to that that document that you guys have been going over. They're called a board. Most states do involve dental hygienists, and it was actually just a few years ago that they added another hygienist to the board. I think it used to be like 2 to 7, and now we have 3 hygienists on there and maybe 5 dentists or something to that effect, and then 1 common person. So it's nice that we're starting to be more represented there. They function to examine licensure, investigate disciplinary action. So every time I attend one of those meetings, there's usually some people that have been brought to their attention that are breaking the law somehow, and they have to determine, what are we going to do to discipline them? Do they lose their law? Are they under probation? Do they lose their law? Do they lose their license? Or are they under probation or whatever? And they may be advised by a secondary body, so if they need more information. So they also have to determine the regulations. So things that are regulated basically means something that is overseen by them. They may not specifically be written in the State Practice Act, but they're overseeing this. So if you look at this, it talks about abuse reporting requirements, biomedical waste and hazard management, business operation practice, consent for treatment and informed consent, criminal activity, disability, education and training requirements, false healthcare claims, so like insurance fraud, liability for volunteer services, malpractice, mandatory malpractice insurance, public health reporting, things like that. So all those things are overseen by the Texas State Board of Dental Examiners. So every state is going to have a practice act. Most of them are separate from the Dental Act, so they have something specific for dental hygiene. And you have to be very familiar with what's on there. When I moved to the state, I had to pass a test, and you guys will have to pass a test to become a hygienist to understand this. And then I think we have to renew it every 3 years, maybe, and retake that test. But it could be more often. Could be a little longer. But anyways, you have to review the laws and regulations, and you can't ever use the excuse of, oh, I didn't know. It's your responsibility to know as a professional. So if you have that question, you have to know it. And as I was kind of reviewing it in preparation for this, it really kind of clarified some of those diagnosis, the dental hygiene diagnosis that we talk about. It's a fine line, because dentists do expect us to diagnose perio and things like that. So there's some interesting parts of that. The Practice Act is licensed by every state, and as far as like what is required for you to be licensed, but most of them are saying you have to be a graduate for a board-approved dental hygiene school, and you have to pass boards. Now, the only exception to that is Alabama. Alabama has an apprentice-style way to become a hygienist, and what they allow is you just to be shadowing or like on-the-job training for 12 months. Now, that's a big deal. If you remember what we talked about as far as a profession, we want to keep our standards high so that we're well respected in the community. And that's why it's so important to be part of your dental hygiene association, because whenever somebody gets wind of something like this, that the hygiene board or the hygiene association is going to fight it tooth and nail. Right now in Illinois, they're trying to allow assistants to do scaling. And so the hygiene association is really fighting that to try to make sure that that doesn't pass. So, if no other reason that you stay involved or stay part of your association is just to say to support the advocacy that occurs for our association. Apparently in Texas, like in the early 90s, they passed something similar to this. But the Hygiene Association said, yeah, you can pass that, but I will require that you, that if they're going to be trained by a dentist, the dentist has to meet all the CODA requirements. And so basically they had to prove, remember how we said you had to prove all the different competencies? Well, no dentist wanted to do that. No dentist was willing to do that. And so nothing really happened with it. And so after about another couple years, when the legislative session came around, they said, okay, let's go back because this isn't even worth it for us. And so we were able to, hold our standards. Well, why did that happen? Because of the Hygiene Association that really stood up for us. Okay, I'm going to get into this in another PowerPoint as far as specifics of different states. So I'm going to skip through this. Okay, when you get your dental licensure, it must be on display. And so mine just barely expired in January, so I just barely submitted a new one, had a new one printed for us to display. And right now, I know here at our school, we've been looking for the things. It's like, what happened to those plaques that had all of them? So it's not displayed yet, but we're working on that. There's a renewal schedule established by state law. So Texas is a biannual, so every 2 years. And renewal for lapsed licensure varies state by state. So some of them give you a grace period and others don't. Practicing without a license is a criminal offense, which is a third-degree felony, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit in upcoming chapters. And non-compliance may lead to monetary fine and or imprisonment. Some people, if they break the rules and regulations in the state, they could have license suspension. So, for example, unprofessional conduct, violation of laws and regulations, clinical incompetence, or substandard care. If you decide that you're going to give local anesthesia here because you've given it in other states, well, that's not part of our practice act here. So you would be breaking a law. Clinical incompetence, meaning you are doing damage, or say you're not diagnosing scaling root planing or bone loss when we need to treat it. Hygienists have been turned into the board about that and or sued. So here's some other examples of unprofessional conduct: fraud, misrepresentation or deception, conviction of a felony, aiding and abetting, sexual conduct with a patient, violation of state or federal laws, mental incompetence, physical illness, and or substance abuse. And you hear of stories of that too, where a dentist or a front office or a hygienist, starts abusing nitrous, or front office gets a hold of a prescription pad and starts writing out opioid prescriptions, things like that. We are required to do CEs. In Texas, it's 12 hours. Now I'm trying to think, is it every year or every other year? I'm pretty sure it's every year. You have to do 12 hours. And then you also have to do a mandatory trafficking course. And one other, I think it's OSHA. We'll talk about it because I'm gonna look that up now. Now, they don't usually audit everybody, but you need to keep good records because you could be that person that gets audited, and you have to basically pull out all your certificates and say, yes, I went to it. A lot of certificates are being sent, via email nowadays, and so you can keep a file of it. If you're a member of ADHA, they have a free way to keep track of all those certificates, which is really nice. Inactive status is available in some states, but in Arkansas, you lose your license if you don't practice for 2 years. Okay. Let's stop here, and then I'll talk about kind of individual states in my next recording.